The river was my place. It wasn't marked on any map, not in the way I knew it. A bend past the old cattle fence, down a narrow path that looked more like a deer trail than anything meant for people. Few ever came out this far, and that's why I did. The water ran slower here, smooth and glassy, catching the last light of day like it wanted to hold it forever. I'd been coming most evenings that summer just to sit, to breathe, to let the kind of silence settle that I couldn't find in town. Out here the world felt bigger, and I felt small in a way that wasn't suffocating but safe. I could lie back on the flat stone at the bank, close my eyes, and almost convince myself that the questions, the ones I kept pushing down, couldn't find me here. That evening the air was heavy with heat. I had rolled my shirt into a pillow under my head, staring up at the slow-turning clouds when I heard it. Boots. At first I thought I imagined it. Nobody came here. But the sound of gravel shifting under weight grew closer until I sat up sharply, heart jumping. He stood a few yards away, just beyond the shade where the last of the sun stretched long across the water. A cowboy, no mistaking it. The hat, the worn jeans, the dust on his boots that said he'd walked farther than most. He carried himself like someone who belonged anywhere he set foot, but he wasn't looking at the river. He was looking at me. "You're not alone here," he said. The words landed like a stone in my chest. Not a threat, not even a warning. Just a truth. His voice was low, steady, carrying easy across the water. I swallowed, my throat dry, and managed a nod. He didn't smile exactly, but something in his face softened. He walked down the slope with the sure step of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, then crouched by the bank. He dipped his hands in, splashed water across his face, rubbed it into the back of his neck. When he straightened, the brim of his hat tipped back just enough for the fading light to catch his eyes. Pale, clear, almost silvery. They caught me off guard. "Luke," he said simply, as if the river had introduced us and all that was left was his name. I told him mine. My voice came out quieter than I meant, but he repeated it anyway, slow and deliberate, like he was trying to see how it felt rolling off his tongue. The river did most of the talking after that. He sat on a rock not far from me, boots set aside, toes brushing the water. We didn't speak much, but every so often I felt it, that weight. His gaze, steady and unhurried, like he was reading me in a language I didn't know I was speaking. I kept my eyes on the water, but the truth was, I could feel him there as much as I could see the current move. The quiet between us wasn't awkward, not exactly, but it wasn't easy either. It was thick like air before a storm. I don't know how long we stayed. Time stretched, folded in on itself. The sun sank lower, the water shifting from gold to darker bronze, shadows pooling at the edges of the bank. Finally I gathered my shirt, shaking off the dust. I could feel his eyes follow the motion, though he didn't say anything until I was standing. "See you around," he said, almost like a promise. I walked the trail back home, the sound of the river fading behind me. But his voice didn't fade. It stayed, repeating, steady as the water itself. That night, lying in bed with the window cracked to let the summer air in, I stared at the ceiling and thought of him. The way he carried himself, the easy way he'd claimed space without asking, the quiet gravity in the way he looked at me. It unsettled something I'd thought was solid, something I'd carefully arranged inside myself. I didn't know what it meant, not yet. But I knew this. When Luke looked at me, I didn't feel invisible anymore. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I wanted to be. A week passed before I saw him again. The days blurred into each other. Sunrise, heat, chores, the quiet evenings when I slipped away to the river. Every time I followed that narrow trail, I wondered if he would be there. Most times he wasn't. But on the 7th evening, as I stepped through the brush, I saw him. He was sitting on the flat rock I usually claimed, boots set aside, long legs stretched toward the water. He leaned back on his elbows, his hat tilted just enough that I could see the line of his jaw, the soft shadow of stubble. When he noticed me, the corner of his mouth pulled up into something that wasn't quite a grin, but close enough to make my chest tighten. "Didn't think you'd come back," he said. I shrugged, feigning casual though my pulse betrayed me. "Didn't think you'd be here either." His laugh was quiet, rough around the edges, like gravel rolling in his throat. The sound seemed to loosen something in the air between us. I sat a few feet away, close enough to hear his breathing when the wind stilled. We talked more than before, small things. Or weather. The way the river seemed to hold the heat better than anything else around here. His voice was unhurried, carrying the cadence of someone used to speaking only when necessary. At one point he leaned back further, arms spread, chest stretching against his shirt. The fabric clung in places and I caught myself staring before I realized what I was doing. He noticed. His eyes flicked to mine, steady and unreadable. For a moment that felt much too long, neither of us looked away. The air seemed to change, thicker, heavier, buzzing with something I couldn't name. My throat went dry. I shifted, pretending to adjust the hem of my shorts, but my skin burned with awareness. As the light faded, he pushed himself up and tugged his shirt over his head. The motion was easy, practiced. He shook out his hair, damp with sweat, and exhaled like the day's weight was finally peeling off. I froze. It wasn't that I hadn't seen men shirtless before. But there was something different in the way Luke carried himself. Like he didn't care if anyone saw him, like he belonged to the land and the river as much as the stones and trees did. The sight of him made my chest feel too tight, as if I'd been holding my breath all along. Without another word, he waded into the water. The river rose to his waist, catching the last fire of the sunset on its surface. He ducked under, came up with a shake and slicked his hair back with both hands. Then he turned, water streaming down his shoulders, and looked straight at me. "You coming in?" he asked. I shook my head too quickly. "Not tonight." He grinned then, this time a real grin, sharp and fleeting. "Suit yourself." I tried to focus on anything else, the rocks, the trees, even the fading light. But my gaze kept returning to him, to the way the water moved against his body, tracing lines I shouldn't have been memorizing. When he finally came back onto the bank, he didn't bother putting his shirt on. He just shook it out, draped it over his shoulder, and dropped down beside me. Closer this time. Close enough that the heat from his skin drifted into me, though the air was already warm. Close enough that I could smell river water and dust and something faintly like cedar on him. He said nothing. Neither did I. The silence felt dangerous and electric, a rope stretched tight between us. I stared straight ahead, but every nerve in my body was tuned to him. The nearness, the way his breathing slowed, the weight of his presence settling into mine. Too close, I thought. Too close to be nothing. When the sky finally deepened into blue, he stood and slipped his boots back on. "See you," he said, the same way he had the first night. I nodded, unable to form words, and watched him walk the path back through the brush. His silhouette disappeared, but the feeling of him stayed behind, thick in the air, pressed against my skin, lodged in my chest. On the way home, I replayed the moment our eyes had locked, the question in it, the answer I hadn't dared give. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading into shadows. But I knew better. It wasn't nothing. It couldn't be. Not when the silence itself felt alive. Silence had always been my refuge. Back home it meant no questions I couldn't answer. Out here by the river it meant peace. But after that night with Luke, him dripping river water, sitting close enough that the heat of his body seeped into mine, the silence wasn't the same anymore. It was louder, sharper. Like it was trying to tell me something I was too afraid to say myself. The next time I found him at the river, the sun was low and heavy. The sky was painted in colors too soft to name, blue melting into gold, gold into rose. Luke was already there, sitting on the rock, elbows resting on his knees. He didn't look up when I approached, but he didn't need to. "You came," he murmured as though he'd been waiting. I sat beside him, not as close as last time, but close enough that I could hear the roughness in his breathing. His hat was pushed back, his hair damp with sweat or river water. It was hard to tell. For a long while we just sat. The water moved, the air pressed down warm and thick, crickets started their song in the grass. I wanted to speak, but every word I thought of dissolved before it could leave my mouth. Luke broke the quiet first. His voice was low, almost like he was talking to himself. "Some days I feel like I'm carrying more than I can hold." I turned to him. His profile was strong in the fading light, but his eyes looked far away, like he was seeing something I couldn't. "What do you mean?" I asked carefully. He gave a humorless laugh, running a hand down his face. "Just life. The work. The expectations. People looking at you like they've already decided who you are. Some nights I get so damn tired of it, I come here just to remember what quiet feels like." His words hit something in me I hadn't admitted out loud. That same weight, that same tiredness, it was carved into me too, even if I'd never put it into words. I didn't know what to say, so I didn't. I let the silence carry what I felt. He glanced at me, then really looked. "You don't talk much, do you?" I shook my head, a little embarrassed. "Never been good at it." He studied me for a moment, his pale eyes unreadable. Then he said, softer this time, "Don't think you need words anyway." My heart stuttered. The river kept moving, steady, endless, but I couldn't hear it anymore. All I could hear was his voice, low and careful, like he was setting something fragile between us. Our knees brushed, barely but enough. He didn't move away. I didn't either. The sky darkened, stars slipping out one by one. The quiet between us thickened, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was full, full of everything we weren't saying, everything we didn't dare. I thought about reaching out, about putting my hand over his, but the fear locked me in place. When he finally stood, the spell broke. He dusted off his jeans, picked up his hat, and placed it on his head. For a second I thought that was it. Another evening of silence, nothing more. But then he touched my shoulder. Just for a moment. Just the warmth of his palm, firm and grounding, like he was telling me without words, "I see you. I know you're here." And then he was gone, walking up the trail without looking back. I sat frozen, the night air cooling the spot where his hand had been. My chest ached with something I couldn't name. By the time I made it home, the touch was still there, burning, echoing, lodged beneath my skin. It stayed with me as I lay in bed, staring into the dark. Not a memory. Not a passing accident. Something else. Something I couldn't explain, but I knew, deep down in the quiet parts of me, that everything had shifted again. And this time there was no pretending it hadn't. The heat hadn't broken in days. Even the nights felt heavy, like the air itself didn't want to move. I almost stayed home that evening, but something pulled me back to the river. Maybe habit, maybe hope. Luke was there waiting. He sat with his boots off, one knee bent, his hand trailing along the rock as if he were restless. When I walked up, he lifted his head, gave me the smallest nod, and then looked back out over the water. I sat beside him without a word. By now we didn't need to announce ourselves. The cicadas hummed, the water whispered, the sky burned with a fading orange glow. Luke started talking, slowly at first, then more steadily. He told me about the ranch, about how the cattle moved like shadows at dusk, how the work never really ended. His voice had a rhythm to it, a low hum that wrapped around me. I listened. I always did. But my attention wasn't only on his words. It was on the way his hand kept moving. His fingers traced the rock, then his thigh, then, almost absent-mindedly, brushed against my knee. The first time it happened, I froze. The second time, I told myself it was an accident. But the third time, when his knuckles lingered against me before pulling away, I knew it wasn't. My heart raced. My mouth went dry. The river might as well have gone silent, because all I could hear was the blood in my ears. Finally his hand stilled, on mine. It wasn't much. Just his calloused palm resting lightly against the back of my hand. Not squeezing, not holding, not demanding. Just there. My breath caught. I wanted to look at him, to read his face, but I couldn't move. My eyes fixed on the horizon as if the world depended on me not breaking the moment. The warmth of his skin sank into mine, steady and grounding, and yet it sent sparks racing through me, making it impossible to think. Minutes passed like that. Maybe longer. My chest rose and fell too quickly, and I wondered if he could feel it, if he knew what he was doing to me. When I finally gathered the courage to glance sideways, I saw his jaw set tight, his gaze fixed on the water. He wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't pull away. I couldn't. The sun sank, shadows stretching long. The first stars blinked above us, and still his hand stayed. Not moving, not retreating, just existing there, as if words had finally failed him and this was all he had left to say. Then, as suddenly as it began, he pulled away. Quick, sharp, like the rock had burned him. He stood, grabbing his hat, shoving it low on his brow. "See you," he muttered, his voice rougher than usual. And then he was gone, his boots crunching against the gravel, his figure swallowed by the darkness. I stayed behind, too stunned to move. My hand still tingled where his had rested. The heat of it hadn't left, even though the air had cooled with nightfall. When I finally walked home, it was with my hand clenched into a fist, as if I could trap the memory there, keep it from fading. Lying in bed, I stared into the dark and replayed every second of it. The way his hand had searched the space between us, the way it had finally found mine. The way he couldn't bear to look at me while it happened. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't nothing. It was a choice. And maybe he regretted it. God, maybe he regretted it the moment it happened. Maybe that was why he left so fast, why his voice had gone tight, why he couldn't stay. But even if he did, even if he wished it away, I didn't. The touch stayed. It stayed in the heat of my skin, in the rush of my heartbeat, in the quiet that followed me into sleep. And I knew then, more clearly than ever before, that something had begun. Something I couldn't ignore, no matter how much easier it would be if I did. The river had always been my place of silence, my refuge from everything I didn't want to face. But now it had become something else. It had become the place where Luke touched me. And no matter what came next, I knew that would never leave me. The next few days felt heavier than the heat itself. I kept going back to the river, though I didn't know if Luke would be there. Part of me hoped he wouldn't, because I didn't know how to look at him after the way his hand had lingered on mine. The other part of me hoped he would, because I couldn't stop wanting to feel that closeness again. When I finally found him there, sitting on the same flat rock as though nothing had happened, my chest tightened. He glanced up, tipped his hat in greeting, and then looked back at the water like it was safer than looking at me. I sat down beside him. Not too close, not too far. The silence pressed down on us, thicker than ever. I thought about the way his hand had burned against mine, the way he'd pulled away like it scared him. I wanted to ask him why. I wanted to ask if he'd meant it. Instead, I stared at the river and said nothing. The minutes dragged. The air buzzed with crickets, the current whispered against the rocks. Finally, I couldn't stand it anymore. "Luke," I said softly. He turned his head just enough to let me know he'd heard, but his eyes didn't meet mine. "That night," I continued, my voice catching, "when you," I faltered, unsure how to say it out loud. "It didn't feel like nothing." His shoulders stiffened. His jaw worked. For a moment, I thought he'd pretend not to understand. But then he let out a breath, rough and shaky. "I know," he said. 2 words, but they cracked the silence wide open. He rubbed his hands over his face, hat tipping forward as though he wanted to hide. "Scares me though. Feels like standing on the edge of something I don't know how to name." My chest ached at the honesty in his voice. I swallowed hard. What if it's something real? His hand stilled. Slowly he lifted his head and turned toward me. His eyes, those pale steel sky eyes, searched mine, steady and unflinching now. The weight of his gaze pressed into me, pulling me closer without a single touch. I held my breath. And then, slowly, carefully, he leaned forward. His forehead touched mine just barely. The world stilled. It wasn't a kiss. It wasn't even an embrace. But the closeness was enough to send my pulse racing, enough to make my breath tremble in my chest. His skin was warm, his presence overwhelming, and yet the moment felt softer than anything I'd ever known. We stayed like that, foreheads pressed together, breathing the same air. My eyes closed without me meaning to, and I felt the weight of him in every part of me. When he finally pulled back, his expression was unreadable, vulnerable, but guarded. Neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. I knew then, in the quiet space between us, that something had shifted beyond repair. We'd stepped past the edge of pretending into something neither of us could deny. It wasn't a confession, not yet. But it was a promise. A promise I carried with me as I walked home in the cooling dark, my forehead still tingling where his had rested against mine. And as much as it scared me, I realized I didn't want to run from it anymore. After that night, our foreheads pressed together, breaths tangled in the dark. Nothing was the same. But we didn't talk about it. Not directly. Instead, something unspoken grew between us. We still met by the river, as if it were the only place that could hold what was happening. But now we sat closer without pretending it was by accident. Our shoulders touched sometimes, our knees brushed, and neither of us moved away. It was in the small things. One evening he brought a thermos of coffee. He didn't say why, just handed it to me with a soft grunt. The warmth spread through me as I drank, not just from the coffee but from the way he watched me, his gaze steady, almost protective. Another night he told me about the horses on the ranch, how each one had its own temper, its own way of testing him. "You gotta earn their trust," he said, eyes narrowing as he skipped a stone across the water. "Can't force it. Can't fake it either. They'll know." Something about the way he said it made my chest tighten. I wondered if he was talking about more than horses. I wanted to tell him that I trusted him already. That I didn't know why, but I did. Instead, I just listened, tucking his words away like a secret. The quiet between us changed too. It wasn't the thick, heavy silence from before, the one filled with fear and confusion. Now it was soft like a blanket. Sometimes we said nothing for hours and it felt full instead of empty. And then one night it happened. The stars were sharp overhead, scattered thick across the sky. We were lying on the grass near the bank, side by side, staring up like the whole universe had opened just for us. I don't know who moved first. Maybe both of us. But suddenly he was closer. Our shoulders pressed together, then our arms. I turned my head and found his eyes already on me, pale and unreadable in the starlight. My chest rose and fell too quickly. My throat went dry. The air between us seemed to hum, heavy with something waiting. He leaned in, hesitant, careful, like he was giving me every chance to turn away. I didn't. I couldn't. His lips brushed mine, feather-like, tentative. The world stilled. It wasn't a kiss, not really, not the way people think of a kiss. It was more like a question, soft and trembling. But I answered by leaning in, closing the space between us until it became something undeniable. His hand came up, hesitant, resting against my jaw. The touch was gentle, almost reverent, as though he couldn't believe it was real. I shivered, not from the night air but from the rush of warmth that spread through me, filling every corner of my chest. We stayed like that, caught in the quietest kiss I'd ever known. No rush, no heat. Just the kind of closeness that made time stop. When he finally pulled back, his forehead rested against mine again. His breath was unsteady, his voice barely above a whisper. Didn't know I was waiting for that. Neither did I. I closed my eyes, letting the words sink into me. My heart ached in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. Because it was true. I hadn't known I was waiting either. Not for him, not for this. But now that it had happened, I couldn't imagine going back. We didn't kiss again that night. We didn't need to. The silence afterward was enough. The kind that said everything words couldn't. When he finally stood, helping me up with a steady hand, we walked the trail together. We didn't speak, but our arms brushed now and then, and each time, it felt like a promise. That night, lying in bed, I touched my lips with the tips of my fingers, still feeling the warmth of him there. And I realized something I hadn't dared admit before. I wanted more. Not just another kiss, not just another night by the river. I wanted all of it, the silence, the laughter, the way his eyes softened when he looked at me. I wanted whatever this was becoming. The summer didn't slow down for us. It rolled on, day after day, hot and steady, the air buzzing with cicadas, the nights thick with stars. But everything felt different now. We still met at the river as if the place belonged to us. Only now we didn't pretend we were just two men sharing space. Our hands brushed often enough that one evening, instead of pulling back, his stayed on mine. He didn't grip. He didn't even lace his fingers through. He just let it rest there, warm and grounding, and I let it stay. We never talked about what it meant. Maybe we were both afraid to put it into words, afraid that naming it would break the spell. But it didn't need naming. It was in the quiet smiles, in the way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, in the way my chest eased whenever I was beside him. One morning, after we'd stayed out too long watching the stars, we ended up at the riverbank when the first light broke. The world was pale blue and soft gold, everything hushed as if it knew not to disturb us. Luke had brought bread and a small jar of jam. He pulled it out of his pack like it was nothing, but I could tell he'd thought about it. He always thought more than he let on. We sat cross-legged on the grass, passing the jar back and forth. I spread the jam too thin, careful and clumsy, and he chuckled. "You do it all wrong," he said, shaking his head. "Show me then." He took the knife from me, his fingers brushing mine longer than necessary. He smeared the jam thick and generous over the bread before handing it back. "Like that." I laughed, but I didn't take it right away. Our fingers lingered, sticky with jam, and for a heartbeat the whole world narrowed to that small, messy touch. He smiled, barely there but enough to soften his face. I'd seen Luke serious, tired, restless, guarded. But that smile, quiet and unguarded, was something else entirely. We ate in silence, watching the sun climb higher. The river caught the light, scattering it across the water like sparks. He leaned back on his elbows, hat tilted low, and said, "Never thought I'd find something like this." My chest tightened. "Like what?" He lifted the brim just enough to look at me. His eyes were pale in the morning light, steady and searching. "Something that feels easy. Right." I didn't know what to say. Words felt too small. So I reached out slowly and touched the back of his hand. He turned his palm over, let our fingers find each other. We sat like that, hand in hand, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I didn't know what tomorrow would look like. Maybe he'd pull away. Maybe the weight of the world outside this river would be too much for him, or for me. We hadn't promised anything. We hadn't even dared to name it. But in that moment, I realized I didn't need forever to know this mattered. Because sitting there in the quiet, with the river whispering and the sun rising over us, I felt seen. Not the version of me I carried around in public, not the guarded self I showed to keep questions at bay. Just me. And Luke, for all his silence and guarded eyes, let me see him too. Later, as we packed up the jar and bread, he caught my gaze and held it. That look, the same steady look from the first night, had changed. It wasn't searching anymore. It was certain. He didn't speak, but he didn't have to. The look was enough. We walked the trail back slowly, our shoulders brushing now and then. Every time they touched, a spark ran through me, not wild but sure. Like the steady strike of flint against stone. When we reached the fork in the path, his way back to the ranch, mine back to town, we stopped. He shifted, pulling his hat lower as though he wasn't sure what to say. Then, almost shyly, he nudged my arm with his knuckles. "Same time tomorrow?" I nodded too quickly and he smiled. We parted ways then, but I carried his smile with me, tucked inside like something precious. Walking home, I thought back to the first words he'd ever spoken to me. "You're not alone here." Back then they'd startled me, unsettled me, cracked the silence I'd built for myself. Now I understood. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And whatever this became, whatever name it took, whatever shape it grew into, I knew I wouldn't undo it. Not for anything.